What if I told you that one of the greatest kings in history started as a simple shepherd boy who spent his days protecting sheep from lions and bears? That the same man who would later defeat a giant and rule a nation was once overlooked by his own family, considered too young and insignificant for any important role? This is the extraordinary story of David, the shepherd boy who became Israel's most beloved king, whose name means beloved, a declaration that would echo through eternity as one of the most powerful testimonies of how God can transform the humble into the mighty. His life would teach us that God doesn't look at outward appearance, but at the heart, that courage can be found in the most unlikely places, and that even our greatest failures can become stepping stones to greater grace. Today, we'll discover how one young man's faith changed the course of history, and why his story still holds the keys to understanding what it truly means to be a person after God's own heart. Our story begins in the small town of Bethlehem, where an ordinary family was about to become part of extraordinary history. Jesse the Bethlehemite had 8 sons, and as was common in that culture, the eldest were given the most attention and responsibility. The youngest, David, was often overlooked and forgotten, relegated to the most basic tasks while his brothers grew strong and capable. But David spent his days in the fields, alone with his thoughts and his God, learning lessons that no palace could ever teach. While his brothers learned about war and politics, David was learning about courage by facing lions and bears who threatened his flock. While others planned their rise to power, David was developing compassion by caring for the weaker sheep. While ambitious men plotted their advancement, David was learning to lead by guiding his sheep to green pastures and still waters. In those solitary fields, David was being prepared for a destiny far greater than he could imagine. The calling came through the prophet Samuel, who arrived at Jesse's house with a secret mission from God. The Lord had rejected King Saul for his disobedience and chosen a new king from Jesse's family. As Samuel looked at Jesse's eldest sons, each impressive in his own way, tall, strong, capable warriors, the Lord said no to each one. Do not look at his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. When Samuel asked if there were any more sons, Jesse mentioned that his youngest was out in the fields tending sheep. Send and get him, Samuel instructed, for we will not sit down till he comes here. When David arrived, probably dusty from the fields and still holding his staff, Samuel knew immediately. Arise, anoint him, God commanded, for this is he. In that moment, a young shepherd boy who had been overlooked and forgotten by his own family became the chosen of the Lord. Samuel took the horn of oil and poured it on David's head, and the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. Imagine the scene: David's brothers watching in shock and confusion as their little brother was anointed as the future king of Israel. But David didn't return home as a changed person seeking advancement. He went back to his sheep, back to the fields, back to his simple life, but now with the knowledge that God had chosen him. The transformation had begun, but it would be years before the world would see what God had been preparing. Meanwhile, in King Saul's court, darkness was settling in. The Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit tormented him constantly. Saul's servants, seeking to soothe their king's troubled mind, suggested finding someone skilled in playing the harp. One of them mentioned David. Not only was he skilled in music, but he was also brave, a warrior, wise in speech, and of good appearance. Most importantly, they added, the Lord is with him. So David was summoned from the fields to the palace, where his musical talents developed during those solitary hours protecting his flock would now be used to comfort a troubled king. Saul was so impressed with David that he made him his armor-bearer, essentially his personal guard and attendant. The young shepherd had entered the royal court, but God's plans were just beginning to unfold. The moment that would define David's youth and change everything came during a war with the Philistines. For 40 days, a giant named Goliath had challenged the Israelite army daily, mocking their God and defying their courage. Send a man to fight me, Goliath would shout. If he can kill me, we will be your servants. But if I kill him, you will be our servants." The entire Israelite army cowered in fear, including King Saul. David, who had been sent to bring supplies to his brothers, heard Goliath's challenge and was indignant. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? When his brother Eliab rebuked him for speaking, David continued asking others the same question until someone reported it to King Saul. When David was brought before Saul to explain his bold words, the king was skeptical. "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he was a man of war from his youth." But David had learned something in the fields that no warrior could teach him, that the same God who had delivered him from the lion and the bear could deliver him from any giant. "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep," David explained, "and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard, and I struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." The courage that had been forged in those solitary fields was now about to face its greatest test. When David faced Goliath, the contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. The giant stood over 9 feet tall, wearing armor that weighed 125 pounds, carrying a spear like a weaver's beam, and with a shield bearer walking before him. David, on the other hand, was just a youth with no armor, no sword, no shield, just a sling and 5 smooth stones from the brook. As David approached, Goliath scorned him. "Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks?" the giant mocked. But David replied with words that would echo through eternity. "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." With a single stone from his sling, David struck Goliath in the forehead, and the giant fell with a crash that shook the earth. David ran and stood over the giant, took Goliath's own sword, and cut off his head. The improbable had happened. Faith had triumphed over fear. A shepherd had defeated a giant, and the living God had been vindicated before all the nations. This victory marked the beginning of David's rise from obscurity to fame. The women of Israel came out singing, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s." But this song would also plant the seeds of jealousy in King Saul's heart. David's victory over Goliath launched him into national prominence, and a beautiful friendship began to form. Jonathan, Saul's son and heir to the throne, was deeply impressed by David. The biblical text tells us that Jonathan's soul was knit with David's soul, and he loved him as himself. Jonathan gave David his own robe, tunic, sword, bow, and belt, essentially recognizing David's right to the throne and abdicating his own position in favor of God's chosen king. This wasn't just friendship, it was spiritual recognition of God's will. As this friendship blossomed, David also gained favor in King Saul's eyes and was given positions of increasing responsibility and leadership in the army. But David's success would soon become a source of deadly jealousy. When the women sang about David's 10,000s compared to Saul's thousands, Saul's anger was kindled. "They have credited David with tens of thousands," he thought, "but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom?" From that moment, Saul kept a close eye on David, and soon the hostility began. The man who had been welcomed into the royal court now found himself in constant danger. Saul would hurl spears at David while he played music, trying to pin him to the wall. David eluded him twice, showing remarkable restraint and respect for the Lord's anointed king, even when that king was trying to kill him. Saul's hatred grew so intense that he offered his daughter Michal to David in marriage, but with a dangerous condition. As a dowry, David would have to bring back 100 foreskins of Philistines, essentially a death sentence disguised as a blessing. But God was with David, and not only did he survive, but he exceeded the requirement, bringing back 200 foreskins. Saul had no choice but to give Michal to David, but the marriage brought no safety. When Jonathan tried to intercede for David, Saul temporarily relented, but the evil spirit would return and Saul would once again seek to kill his son-in-law. The breaking point came when Saul sent messengers to David's house to kill him. Michal warned David of a danger and helped him escape through a window. This marked the beginning of David's years as a fugitive in his own country. The man who had been Israel's national hero was now forced to live as a homeless wanderer, sought by the king he had served faithfully. During this difficult period, David learned some of the most important lessons of his life. He discovered that God's promises sometimes require waiting, that character is forged in the furnace of adversity, and that true greatness comes not from grasping for power, but from trusting in God's timing. David's years as a fugitive taught him to depend completely on God. He composed many of the Psalms during this time, pouring out his heart to the Lord in songs of lament, trust, and hope. He also demonstrated remarkable character when he had opportunities to kill Saul, but refused to do so. In the cave of En-Gedi, when Saul entered to relieve himself, and David could have easily killed him, David crept up and only cut off a corner of Saul's robe, then felt guilty for even that small act of disrespect toward the Lord's anointed. Later, when David sneaked into Saul's camp and found the king sleeping, he again refused to kill him, saying, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the Lord's anointed." These acts of restraint demonstrated David's deep understanding that the kingdom belonged to God, not to him. It wasn't David's job to take what God had promised. It was his job to remain faithful while God fulfilled his promises in his own time. This character would define David's entire life and set him apart from the ambitious men who would rise to power through violence and intrigue. Saul's pursuit of David would only end with the king's death in battle against the Philistines. When the news reached David, his reaction was one of lament and honor, not celebration. Even after years of persecution, David could still see the good in Saul and honor his memory. He composed a beautiful lament for Saul and Jonathan, calling them swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. This demonstrated the nobility of David's character. He could honor his enemies and maintain integrity even when they had shown him none. After Saul's death, David inquired of the Lord about his next steps, showing the pattern of seeking God's guidance that would characterize his entire reign. When God told him to go to Hebron, David went, where he was anointed king over Judah. But the path to ruling all Israel would require patience and faith. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was proclaimed king over the other tribes, initiating a period of civil war. David grew stronger while Saul's house grew weaker, but the process of unification took time and required wisdom. One of the most significant moments came when David demonstrated his commitment to justice and integrity, even when it meant punishing his own men. When Joab, David's military commander, assassinated Abner in revenge for his brother's death, David condemned the act and declared himself and his kingdom innocent before the Lord. This established a precedent that justice would be administered fairly, regardless of the perpetrator's position or relationship to David. The civil war ended with the assassination of Ishbosheth by his own captains, who thought they would gain favor with David. But David's response surprised everyone. He had the assassins killed for murdering an innocent man, even though their actions had cleared the way for his own coronation. This action demonstrated that David would not build his kingdom on bloodshed and treachery, but on righteousness and justice. Finally, all Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" With this recognition, David was anointed king over all Israel, fulfilling the promise God had made through Samuel years before. The shepherd boy was now the king of a unified nation. One of David's first priorities as king was to establish Jerusalem as the capital. The choice was brilliant strategically. Situated on the border between northern and southern tribes, Jerusalem could serve as a unifying point for the nation. Moreover, since it wasn't associated with any specific tribe, it could become truly national rather than tribal. After conquering the Jebusites who controlled the city, David established Jerusalem as both the political and spiritual capital of Israel. But David's reign would not be without its challenges and failures. At the height of his power and success, David committed a sin that would have lasting consequences. While his army was at war, David remained in Jerusalem and committed adultery with Bathsheba, then murdered her husband Uriah to cover up his crime. The consequences were severe. The sword would never depart from David's house, and the child born of his sin would die. Yet when confronted by the prophet Nathan, David repented genuinely, and God forgave him. This story teaches us that even the greatest servants of God are not immune to sin, but that genuine repentance brings forgiveness and restoration. The most painful consequence came when David's son Absalom rebelled against him, forcing the aging king to flee from Jerusalem in a scene that echoed his own earlier flight from Saul. But David's response to this rebellion showed his spiritual maturity. When Shimei cursed him during his flight, David refused to have him killed, saying, "The Lord has told him to curse me. Perhaps the Lord will look upon my misery and restore to me his blessing instead of his curse today." When the rebellion was crushed and Absalom killed despite David's explicit orders to spare him, David's lament over his son's death was one of the most emotional moments in the Bible. Near the end of his reign, David took a census of the people against God's instructions, resulting in a plague that killed 70,000 Israelites. The plague was only stopped when David built an altar and offered sacrifices at the site that would later become the location of the temple. This incident reminded both David and all Israel that even kings must submit to God's will and follow his instructions. Despite his failures, David maintained a heart that was always turned toward God. When he fell into sin, he repented. When he made mistakes, he learned from them. When God corrected him, he accepted the discipline. This is why, despite his flaws, David is remembered as a man after God's own heart. It wasn't because he was perfect, but because his heart was always seeking God, always responding to God's correction, always returning to fellowship with his Creator. David's greatest legacy was not his military victories or political achievements, but his relationship with God and the hope he left for future generations. God made an eternal promise to David that his kingdom would never end, a promise that would find its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ, the Son of David. David's Psalms continue to comfort and inspire believers today, expressing the full range of human experience while maintaining unwavering faith in God's goodness and sovereignty. The story of David teaches us profound lessons about God's sovereignty and grace. God chose the youngest son, the overlooked shepherd, the one others considered insignificant. This reminds us that God often works through the unlikely and underestimated to accomplish his purposes. David's life shows us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but faith in God's power despite our fears. His story demonstrates that waiting on God's timing is often harder than taking action, but it's always better in the long run. Most importantly, David's life teaches us about forgiveness and restoration. His sin with Bathsheba could have ended his relationship with God, but genuine repentance brought forgiveness and restoration. This gives us hope that no matter how far we may have fallen, forgiveness and restoration are always available to those who turn to God with sincere hearts. David's journey from shepherd to king was not just a personal story of success, but a testimony to the transformative power of God in a human life. It shows us that God can use imperfect people to accomplish his perfect purposes, and that true greatness lies not in the absence of flaws, but in the continual willingness to seek God in all circumstances of life. Today, when we face our own giants, whether they are fears, failures, seemingly insurmountable challenges, or overwhelming circumstances, we can remember David and his words to Goliath. I come to you in the name of the Lord. The same God who delivered David from the lion and the bear, who gave him victory over Goliath, who made him king over Israel, and who forgave him when he fell into sin, is the same God who is with us today. David's life reminds us that God doesn't look at outward appearance, but at the heart, that he can use the humble to confound the mighty, and that his plans for our lives are often greater than we can imagine. Whether we're tending sheep in obscure fields or sitting on thrones of influence, whether we're facing giants of fear or failure, whether we're celebrating victories or mourning defeats, we can learn from David's example to trust in God's sovereignty, to wait patiently on his timing, and to keep our hearts turned toward him in all circumstances. The shepherd boy who became a king, the young man who faced a giant, the fugitive who learned to trust, the king who fell and was restored. David shows us that with God, no life is too broken, no dream too impossible, and no future too uncertain. He was a man after God's own heart because ultimately his heart was always seeking God. May we, like David, be people after God's own heart, trusting in his grace, responding to his correction, and dedicating our lives to his service. If this incredible story of faith, courage, and God's transforming power has touched your heart, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel for more amazing biblical stories that will strengthen your faith and deepen your relationship with God. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we upload new content that can transform your spiritual journey. And please don't keep this powerful testimony to yourself. Share this video with your family, friends, and anyone who needs to hear about the God who can use unlikely people to accomplish his extraordinary purposes. Together, we can spread these timeless truths that have the power to change lives and draw people closer to their Creator. Thank you for joining me on this journey through David's remarkable life. Until next time, may you be inspired to be a person after God's own heart, just as David was thousands of years ago. God bless.